That's really interesting, Gareth. Can I ask you then something that, again, it's been a long time since any of my children had to go for, the assessment of need where they would have received a diagnosis. But I read something recently because I'm obviously a parent, in a parent group where a parent was saying that on the report, it said that the child had a diagnosis of autism, but it didn't meet, I think it's, and I don't know the exact wordings, I'm sure I'm saying this wrong, but it didn't meet I suppose, what wasn't being recognised as a disability. Now, I could have that piece wrong. You might be able to clarify that. Have you been seeing any of that coming across your desk? And if so, what can families do? Now, I'm sure for anyone listening, I've said that incorrect because it wouldn't be my personal experience. I don't know the exact wording, but I definitely read something to that effect. And then I saw somebody talking about it on social media. I thought, God, that's very, horrifying as well, if they're not even recognising this diagnosis as a disability. It was specifically to do, I think, in relation to as recognised as a disability under the Disability Act. Has something like that or anything, does that make any sense to you, or have you been seeing anything like that come across your desk?
Yes, that is one of those features that have really sort of crept in the last, say, 6 months or so, where, a child goes through the process of having had an assessment of need, has an autism diagnosis with a list of 30 recommendations in relation to schooling, in relation to social supports, in relation to emotional supports, in relation to sensory supports, in relation to whatever the case may be. And then suddenly they get the finalized assessment of need report, which says your child does not have a disability for the purposes of the Disability Act. Now, that is a decision that is taken by your assessment of need officer, who is, for the most part, not a clinician, and where they don't deem to meet the definition of disability under the Disability Act. So if anyone, Googles the Disability Act, they actually see that disability is defined within the Disability Act. It's a very, very long sentence. And so that is where they're saying you don't meet that definition. The problem for parents is the High Court has made it clear that if you don't meet the definition of disability under the Disability Act, you're not entitled to your service statement. The second thing, though, to say to you is that and I've had actually a number of consultations this week in relation to this very particular issue. A parent can bring a complaint under two grounds. One is around the finding of no disability, Section 14(1)(a) of the Disability Act, or if they're concerned in any way about the manner in which the assessments themselves were carried out, and that they're reading the report and they're concerned about the manner in which it was done, or they're concerned about the commentary, or there may be factual errors within the report, or whatever the case may be. Section C, that the reports or the assessments themselves weren't done in conformity with the necessary standards. Those provide two options for parents in those circumstances. And again, we have seen in recent times assessments of need officers pulling back from the brink in those circumstances, reviewing it again. And so, for example, I had a case during the week where an assessment of need officer issued a report without the CAMS report having been completed, even though they're in the process of doing the CAMS report, without the educational assessment having been completed, even though there was a referral through to the NCSE. So the question arises as to how did you determine that the child didn't meet the definition of disability without, the CAMS report on your table, without the educational input being on the table, etc., etc. And so we're in a situation now where that has happened. I can think of another family that we were in fact in the High Court with, the Court of Appeal with, who again didn't meet the definition of disability ultimately. And I mean, it was incredible, that a finding, given the profile of that child. But that has been reviewed successfully, and the child is now, in fact, I'm meeting the parents next week to discuss their service statement. But they would never have been entitled to that service statement without the definition of disability being met. So I think that this is going to be a new ground that we're going to see a lot more of. But again, all I would want parents to know in those circumstances is that there are options in respect of those types of outcomes, and potentially successful outcomes based on the circumstances of your case.
Can I ask you then, Gareth? So say if today I had a fifth child, which isn't going to happen, I'm definitely too old, but if I magically did, was blessed to have another child, and that gorgeous child turned out to also be autistic, and say I got that report and it said doesn't meet the definition of disability under the Disability Act, is this something, if I'm a parent listening, is this something I should act on? And if I should act on, why is this necessary that I get that clarified? Like, what impact negatively? Because say if I know the profile of my child and they do have needs in X, Y, and Z, if they didn't pursue this to have this clarified, say, does it affect their educational accessibility to different supports, or what specifically would this, what negative impact not having this specific definition recognised? What would be the things that would stand out to you as to, oh, make sure we go and get that clarified? Why are those standout reasons for you, I suppose? And that might bring us to the end, because I think I've taken up almost 2 hours of your time at this point. So if you don't mind, what do you think, or what should parents be considering in that regard?
I mean, there's different ways of answering that question. I guess the first and fundamental one that we've just talked about is you don't have your service statement. Okay, so any services that you may acquire will really be by luck rather than by design. And of course, when a parent is in that situation, they have two choices. They can just simply pay for everything privately, or they will be in a situation where they will be able to make the referrals themselves to the primary care teams, but that will be absolutely subject to whatever they can muster, and really no comeback at all, no real comeback at all in terms of challenging that. Whereas at least if you have a service statement, and if you're unhappy with the contents of your service statement or on the services being provided, there's a legal framework there under the Disability Act to really have a go at that. In terms of where does it go elsewhere, it really does depend on the circumstances of your particular case. There isn't anything that is automatically ruled out, if I can use that term. But I guess having the completed assessment of need and your service statement perhaps opens other doors, like it does assist applications like domiciliary care allowance. It does assist in availing of certain educational supports within schools. It helps schools, let's face it, it helps schools in terms of gaining added supports in terms of, special educational needs teachers, or, in relation to, SNA support for schools. There are unknowns in relation to it. It's helpful because it's helpful without us even being realizing, and it's not even that tangible, but it is real and effective because, if you're in a situation where you have a completed assessment of need, doesn't it tell us so much about the profile of that child? Doesn't it potentially tell us a lot about what they're going to need to be able to navigate, particularly through the educational system? Doesn't it really help many schools in terms of understanding that child and what might trigger emotional regulatory issues, those overwhelming issues? It really helps because it's other people saying it from a professional perspective rather than the mother and that awful solicitor she has. It has soft power as well as real power at times. And also too, if we look at the range of supports that might be available, it helps, like when parents and pupils in schools are looking at reasonable accommodations for exams in secondary school, where a child, may have had some relevant testings done that would be relevant in terms of assistive technology grants, use of laptops, Irish language exemptions, all of the other range of supports that take that little bit of pressure off a child. And it has that sort of domino effect. So I'm not saying to parents, because it's not the end of the world if the definition isn't reached. And for some parents, they are quite happy that the definition hasn't been reached, and they're happy to kind of take that and go. But for those parents who worry about whether or not that's the right decision, then it's better to have it reviewed than to always wonder, was that the right call? Because we see already, even in the very small number of cases where this has now become an issue, the fact that some of those decisions are already being overturned. That's a big decision to make, and it has unforeseen consequences on the pathway through life. And also when you think about it, and you'll know this far better than me through your own personal journey, Amanda, there's a lot of talk out there about autism diagnoses and whether or not, too many people are going for an assessment of need, and whether or not too many people are as if, they're getting a diagnosis of, all of this really unhelpful, quite cruel at times debate that's out there. But I had a 19-year-old person who sat on a Zoom in front of me recently who described themselves as a very proud autistic teenager. And I thought that because this is part of, as he explained to me, his identity. So can you imagine a part of your identity not being appreciated, not being properly given expression to? We wouldn't do it with any other minority group. It would be seen as a grounds for discrimination under the Equal Status Acts. And I feel really, really grubby listening to some commentary at the moment around, whether or not we've too many autistic people diagnosed, and, what is this about, and is everyone's trying to look for an autism diagnosis. That is, I imagine, incredibly hurtful and very damaging and very othering to the autistic community. Because the reasons, from my perspective, and I don't know what your view of this is, we are playing catch up here. That's the reason that we're in the situation we are in at the moment, in terms of the availability of schools, availability of proper supports in schools, availability of social supports. We're playing massive catch up from a very low base. And that's the reason we're in the space we're in. And we're also in a very dangerous time, because we celebrate rightly the role of the autistic people in the workplace, in our communities, in our schools, and all of these things. But I'm hearing and sensing, even since the last election, this creeping commentary. Do we need to look at legislative change around the assessment of need process? Do we need to look at legislative change? I think I put a tweet out about this recently, where my point is, when I hear that phrase, the alarm bells go off, because what I wonder is, the reason the problem is this, the reason that there is the challenge that is there at the moment is because those assessments of need are not being done within the timeframes permitted by law. And I sense that any amendment will only actually seek to dilute that very important right about having your assessment of need done within the time frame permitted by law. And I worry about, are we on the cusp of doing something very non-child centered, a real breach of an autistic person's. We saw this with the ill-fated preliminary team assessment that we all told them would be struck down by the High Court, and it was, and thousands of children were caught in the trap of having done the preliminary team assessment. We'll do a screening to see whether or not you need to have an autism assessment. And now, by the way, that's your assessment of need. That was the model. It was vile, and it had real damage. And that damage, we are still catching up with that. So I'm slightly concerned, as I say, and actually the only real change we need in the law is to make service provision a legal entitlement, rather than having to go through all of these hoops. That's the only amendment to the law that I'm interested in, and that families that you work with are interested in, because again, it's a lot of families would say to me, and I'm sure they say to you as well, I've gone through the assessment of need process now, and I have these assessments. It was a great battle, and this is great. And it is. But it is only as good as its implementation. It's only as good as what the follow-on is in relation to that. It's only as good as whether or not that child, not just their parents, but that child avails of a proper service that has been recommended for them in that multidisciplinary assessment that might have been conducted by an OT or a speech and language therapist and a psychologist all working together. I sense that we are making huge strides and huge progress, but we still really, really do have a further stretch in the road. It's a little bit like an athletics track. You've kind of come around the bend and you think, oh, I'm nearly at the end line now. And then you come to the end and the guy's there with the ticker tape, and suddenly they run off around the other corner and you have to keep going. It doesn't have to be this difficult. It shouldn't be this hard. And I often think that we had a recent Taoiseach that had this ambition of making Ireland the best small country in the world in which to be a child. And I think that is an amazing objective, but we have a long, long way to go in order to have that realized. But we are getting there. And people like you, Inclusion Ireland, as I am, all of these great and wonderful organizations and Facebook groups that I work with, slowly but surely that catch up is beginning to happen, and it's really exciting. And it's something that's been it's a real privilege to have I won't say a front row seat, but certainly be at it from a good vantage point. It really is.
What I would actually say as the parent watching on and being part of that, as you were kind of saying, going around that racetrack. I've been on and off the racetrack over the years, and I'm sure as my gorgeous Connor, grows from he's 15 now, grows into, I suppose, becoming an adult. You've mentioned the Incredible As I Am and Inclusion Ireland, families like my own that would kind of try and advocate in their own ways online and whatnot. But you probably didn't give yourself enough of a mention there. And that's kind of how I started the podcast. Maybe I'll end the podcast just to say that for families to know that there's individuals like yourself, that there is the KOD line solicitors, that there are the Gareth Nobles in the world, that we have somebody to speak up for our families, that we can go to a solicitor who can tell us, okay, well, do you realise you have legal rights here? And like families, just like my own, are overwhelmed, as you were saying, like doing the battle for this child, that child, for this segment, for that piece, to get their disability even recognised under the definition of disability. It's really, really powerful to me, because I feel like we've kind of been on the journey together in a way, because you came to Mayo all those years ago. I remember you had the floor. Everyone was mesmerised, because for the first time ever in the West in particular, we had, as I would call it, a hot shot from Dublin called Gareth Noble came to the West and came to this huge hotel, I think it was down in Ballina, and spoke to all of us, but gave us all for the first time. I remember you came down with you had all of these forms and everything with information for everyone. It was so well done. You had DCA forms, but like explainers of exactly how to fill it out and what I think was part of the assessment of needed at that time as well, as years ago. But what really stood out to me was that it was like a shining light in the room. But you were as beautiful and blonde as you are, but you were that shining light in the room for families just like my own, and everyone went away that day feeling really empowered. And that's why I think all of the families that listen to the podcast and the professionals and the organizations, it is that word that I kind of used earlier, it is that collaboration. But what I want to say is that we always need that one person that's out in front kind of fighting for families just like my own, because as much as I would like to have the energy, I'm fighting for 4 children and I'm exhausted. I'm aging myself at this point now. I'm hitting mid-40s, so I'm tired as well. But it's great to have individuals like yourself. And I just want to thank you again, as I thanked you many years ago when you came to the West. It was such a privilege, first of all, that you take some of such your busy time, but take some of that time to come to the West to help families just like my own. But even again this evening, to share that vital information, because not every family might realise that they have those rights, or even that piece around how that piece that we mentioned about the definition. Does your child meet that definition? Like, I only read it in passing in a Facebook group, and I thought, God, I must ask Gareth if I get the opportunity. So what I'll say, I suppose, coming to the end of the podcast, is say a massive thank you to yourself, to the firm, and in particular for all of the advocacy, and even the advocacy that you do on Twitter. You're on fire on Twitter, but you're always on point, and you speak, although I know it's in text, so eloquently, but you're always to the point. This is why you're the solicitor, I would argue. I just think you're absolutely an incredible human being. And as you said about the picture at the start of the little person on the bus, anytime I see families thriving and getting on well and their rights being recognised, I'll always come back to the younger, still equally as handsome Gareth Noble that came to Mayo all those years ago and stood up and told all of the families their rights in the West of Ireland, same as you've done tonight through the podcast. And for people that will listen into the future, I just want to thank you, because if there wasn't individuals like yourself, right, I would call it rights upholders, that tell families, that it's okay to stand up and say, this is scary, but I'm going to need your help on this, because I don't really know how to navigate this. So thank you for being that person, not only for people like myself that are autistic, for children just like my own, but for families that are listening, and for the professionals that sometimes will seek you out as well, to try and get those rights of their students or the families that they support upheld. So I'll give the last word to yourself, Gareth. So thank you.
Well, I'm for one speechless, Amanda. Thank you very much. That's really, really kind. And as I said, like I said at the start, like my own office now resembles a classroom in itself, because I've got all these wonderful pieces of art and letters from cards from children and their family, and that to me is the nicest part of this job. And I'm going to correct you on one thing. When I came to the West, I came as a West of Ireland man, not a Dublin man, because as I said to you, I'm originally from Fermanagh, so I'm a West of Ireland man. So I'm certainly, my wife and son are Dubs, but you can't take the Western Ireland man out. And certainly, I'm still very proud of my Fermanagh heritage, even though, as I say, it's over a majority of my life now that I've spent outside the nicest county in Ireland. But thank you so much for this invitation, for all the work that you do. I mean, I remember hearing you speak for the first time, and I was, it's just one of those standout moments when you actually hear from somebody who describes so eloquently and so brilliantly and so with great humor the life story that you've had, and that you do it all with such grace and with such energy, and really in a way that actually is so inspiring for others. And I can imagine for autistic mums, autistic dads, autistic teenage, or autistic young people to see someone like you who just talks so freely and so eloquently and so honestly must be such an inspiration to them. Certainly, I remember hearing you speak for the first time at an event, and I think it was when you had just recently got involved with As I Am, and I mean, I could even just hear the people around me, you could hardly hear a pin drop in relation to it. But when you have these information sessions as well, a bit of humor is not a bad thing, because there's sometimes too much darkness. And so to have that somebody who can get up with a smile on their face, and who can, because you do lots of public stuff. I have to do it from time to time and do it as well. And really what you want those experiences for your audience to be is not to go out and feel lost and full of doom and gloom. But the objective always is, and I think we've had this discussion, I think, over a glass one night somewhere. You want someone to leave that room with more hope than when they put their bum on the chair in the first place. And you have to sometimes be very real and really honest about people, about what can be. I mean, one of the things that you and I always have to do is to explain to people what is not possible as well as what is possible. But the possibilities far outweigh the non-possibilities. And to give people that bit of hope is, if that's all you give them, well, then that's good enough. So thank you so much for this really kind invitation, and good luck with the rest of your podcast series for the coming.
Thank you so much, Gareth. And listen, I'll leave everyone be now, and I suppose maybe I'll say it again now. I got thrown by you being so kind. Okay, I'll say it again. So thank you so much, Gareth, and thank you to all of our listeners. And again, I'll have all of Gareth's details in the, I suppose, description part of the podcast. And if you do need that legal support, absolutely, again, as a parent, as a professional, I cannot recommend Gareth highly enough. Just even from a humanity level, what an incredible human. So I'll go. Thanks everyone for listening, and I'll see you again, or you'll hear me again next week. So thank you. Bye.